Welcome to the Tim Booker Book Sharing channel. Like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our updates. Let's explore the world of books together.
Today, the book I want to talk to you about is The Long Peace by the top American international relations scholar Gaddis. This is a representative work of Gaddis, with over 350 pages and 330,000 words. Its subtitle is An Inquiry into the History of the Cold War. When you hear this title, you might think it's a comprehensive history of the twists and turns of the Cold War, but it's not. On the contrary, it is a complex theoretical book, not easy to read, with over 130 pages of references alone. Despite being a challenging professional work, it has received recommendations from U.S. Presidents Reagan and George H.W. Bush and has been reprinted 4 times in the past 30 years. The term the long peace, coined by the author Gaddis, has even become a term in the study of international politics, still in use today. If you want a deeper understanding of world events and a bit more knowledge of international politics, then The Long Peace is definitely a good starting point. Why does Gaddis's book have such a high academic standing? Because it presents some counterintuitive findings about international relations, and it can justify them. For example, in the common perception, the world during the Cold War was fraught with crises, and humanity lived under the shadow of nuclear war every day. However, Gaddis argues, not true. In the 1940s and 1950s, there were 6 local wars breaking out worldwide each year, with 240 people dying per million people. But by the end of the Cold War, there was only 1 local war per year globally, causing less than 10 deaths per million people. Based on this, Gaddis points out, for the Western world, the Cold War was the period with the fewest direct conflicts and the least economic losses since the 16th century. The existence of nuclear weapons actually made countries less willing to use force casually. This state is what the title refers to as the long peace. It is not perfect, but it is beneficial for humanity. Moreover, Gaddis claims that the long peace was not pre-designed but spontaneously formed. Before the Yalta Conference at the end of World War II, there were no detailed regulations for all aspects of the post-war order. New situations, such as the political affiliation of Eastern Europe and the division of the Korean Peninsula, spontaneously emerged in the subsequent historical evolution. The 2 superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, never clearly delineated their spheres of influence in black and white. They adopted a flexible and maneuverable attitude towards new changes in the world situation, which actually helped prevent large-scale wars. Therefore, Gaddis concludes, peace is an objective outcome, and it may not necessarily be associated with good motives or meticulous design. The maneuvering between major powers may also lead to peace, and may even be more conducive to maintaining peace. At this point, you might ask, why do Reagan and George H.W. Bush admire Gaddis's theory so much? Is it just because he talks about some vague general principles? Certainly not. In The Long Peace, Gaddis also summarizes the overall rules of major power diplomacy during the Cold War era. Some of these rules are inherent in the international system, while others were explored by the United States and the Soviet Union themselves. The continuity of The Long Peace is the result of everyone following these rules. In the 21st century, the rules summarized by Gaddis are still widely validated in global diplomacy and have withstood the test of time. They have even entered the business domain, giving rise to a specialized discipline called grand strategy. Therefore, studying The Long Peace not only serves the purpose of reviewing history but also meets many of your practical needs. The author of this book, Lewis Gaddis, is a professor of military and naval history at Yale University, with over half a century of research on the history of the Cold War. The New York Times refers to him as the preeminent English-speaking authority on the Cold War, and President George H.W. Bush asked him to help edit speeches. Although Gaddis did not follow the path of study and then serve like Kissinger, his ability to combine historical research and policy analysis is equally admirable. His lengthy biography of George F. Kennan, the father of U.S. Cold War policy, won the Pulitzer Prize in 2012. This book, The Long Peace, written in 1987, is one of Gaddis's representative works in his academic career. It not only elevated the study of the history of the Cold War in the United States to new heights but also helped him become the president of the American Society for Diplomatic History. I believe it will be very rewarding for you as well. Next, I will introduce the main content of this book to you in 2 parts. First, let's take a look at the characteristics of the international system during the Cold War era and the influence it exerted on the interactions between the United States and the Soviet Union. In the second part, I will summarize the rules that, in Gaddis's view, the United States and the Soviet Union explored during the Cold War era. These rules played a role in preventing the 2 countries from engaging in a devastating nuclear war. When it comes to the academic discipline of international politics, your first reaction is likely. It studies sovereign nations, especially the interactions among major powers. Indeed, even in the 21st century, while international organizations and multinational corporations have gained increasing influence, states remain the most important actors in world politics. They sometimes coexist peacefully, and at other times, wars erupt, creating complex relationships. Among nearly 200 sovereign countries worldwide, some possess strong military, economic, and technological capabilities, and these are referred to as major powers. Major powers play a more prominent role in international political activities, leading to higher visibility. However, author Gaddis argues that to understand international politics, merely focusing on individual countries is not enough. One must also consider the concept of the international system. What is the international system? Simply put, it is the overall system formed by the interactions of sovereign nations. To illustrate, think of various vehicles on a road, some large, some small, some fast, some fuel efficient. The sovereign nations are like these vehicles, and the international system is the condition of the entire road. Each driver hopes their vehicle smoothly reaches its destination without encountering accidents. Even if everyone follows traffic rules, accidents still happen, sometimes due to a vehicle malfunction, other times because a driver succumbs to road rage. In the realm of international politics, these crises and wars affect the normal functioning of the system. But fundamentally, even the largest and fastest vehicles find it challenging to override the right-of-way of other vehicles. At most, they can gain a slight advantage by changing lanes or running a yellow light. Similarly, the international system, while influenced by major power relations, is challenging to overturn suddenly. In Gaddis's view, what are the characteristics of the international system during the Cold War period? The answer is a familiar term, bipolarity, referring to the coexistence of the United States and the Soviet Union. It is noteworthy that in the history of Western countries, this was the first instance where two nations dominated the entire world order. Previous bipolar structures, such as Athens and Sparta in ancient Greece, were limited to smaller regions. As for the global distribution of power, it typically involved either a single superpower or multiple strong nations simultaneously. Therefore, the question of whether the bipolarity of the United States and the Soviet Union could be maintained for the long term quickly became the focus of academic attention. Hans Morgenthau, the renowned American international relations scholar and foreign policy advisor to President Kennedy, believed that a multipolar structure was far more stable than bipolarity. The confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union would eventually escalate into a devastating nuclear war. British scholar Edward Carr argued that it would be difficult for the United States and the Soviet Union to restrain their allies, and a third pole would inevitably emerge. However, as Gaddis points out, these experienced scholars' predictions were proven wrong. The situation of peaceful coexistence between the United States and the Soviet Union not only lasted for over 40 years but also persisted until the dissolution of the Soviet Union without a genuine challenger emerging. Gaddis believes that this situation is related to the nature of the bipolar system itself. Even before the end of World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union were the militarily strongest nations globally. They both possessed vast military-industrial complexes, abundant manpower reserves, and a series of overseas bases, surpassing all other countries significantly. Moreover, the international political focus during the Cold War was precisely on military and security affairs, aligning perfectly with the strengths of the United States and the Soviet Union. As a result, leaders of the United States and the Soviet Union did not need to worry about other issues and could focus on monitoring their opponents. This, in turn, further consolidated the bipolar system. Gaddis's argument is not baseless. There are two classic cases of peace systems in international relations history: the Vienna system in the early 19th century and Bismarck's system in the late 19th century. Kissinger speaks highly of these two systems. Still, Gaddis astutely points out that the Vienna system and Bismarck system fall under multipolar structures. The member states of these systems experienced drastic power shifts and had unstable psychological states. Stability could only be maintained by diplomatic giants like Metternich and Bismarck. Once they retired, stability disappeared. However, the situation was different in the US-Soviet bipolar structure. Gaddis jokes that this system doesn't pick sides. Regardless of whether the US president was Truman or Nixon or the Soviet leader was Stalin or Brezhnev, their policy differences only affected the hard power of the United States and the Soviet Union but did not overturn the fundamental premise of the bipolar system. Using the analogy of the traffic example mentioned earlier, during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were like two oversized, overweight trucks occupying the entire road. Their speeds might vary, and the driver's skills might differ, but the international system, the road conditions was still under their control. Unless absolutely necessary, no driver wanted the trucks to collide, and they all exercised some caution. Thus, a relatively peaceful situation emerged under the bipolar system. At this point, you might still have questions. Aren't there other vehicles running on the road conditions of the international system? Why would allies of the United States and the Soviet Union, and even some neutral countries, willingly submit to their arrangements? This has to do with the legacy of World War II. The anti-fascist alliance won World War II, but when establishing the world order after the war, the leading roles were played by the United States and the Soviet Union. The two superpowers in Europe, based on their final marching range, divided influence zones, forming the later Iron Curtain. Armies of both sides confronted each other across this Iron Curtain for an extended period. Gaddis believes that this situation resulted in a peculiar consequence called concentration of threats. Both the United States and the Soviet Union recognized that their most significant existential threat came from the military power on the other side of the Iron Curtain. They needed to pool all resources to deal with this imminent threat. Under the pressure of Soviet security, the United States, in 1947, announced the Marshall Plan to proactively provide financial assistance for Western Europe's reconstruction. Later, it established the military alliance organization NATO. The Soviet Union responded in kind, forming its economic alliance, Comecon, and military alliance, Warsaw Pact. These two evenly matched groups confronted each other for more than 40 years, turning Europe into the front line of the Cold War. Don't think that such a standoff merely involves tanks and planes on paper. At the edges of the Iron Curtain, East and West Germany and Poland, tactical nuclear weapons were deployed by the United States and the Soviet Union. In case of a real war, NATO and the Warsaw Pact would directly use nuclear missiles to stop the advance of enemy forces. Conversely, countries like Poland and East/West Germany would heavily depend on each other's nuclear umbrella, avoiding easy changes of allegiance. Therefore, in Cold War-era Europe, aside from Yugoslavia and Albania breaking ties with the Soviet Union and France temporarily leaving NATO, the alliance system remained stable, providing a double insurance for the bipolar structure. In the long piece, Gaddis also compares the post-World War II bipolar system with the Versailles system after World War I. He points out that while the Versailles system seemed to propose a lofty ideology, including collective security, national self-determination, and international arbitration, it completely ignored the power distribution in reality. The system excluded the Soviet Union and left the new independent small Eastern European countries to face the threat from Germany alone. Such a system was unlikely to last. In contrast, the post-World War II bipolar system, although tinted with power politics, clearly delineated spheres of influence and relied on military force as a backing, avoiding self-destruction of the system. For example, at the Yalta Conference in 1945, the United States initially intended for Poland and Yugoslavia to become a neutral buffer zone. However, 3 years later, when the Soviet control in southeastern Europe became sufficiently established, the United States accepted the reality. Through this example, Gaddis tells us that the bipolar system is not pre-designed. It is an acknowledgement and reinforcement of established facts, and its stability lies hidden in reality. Of course, Gaddis also acknowledges Cold War-era Asia was different from Europe. The United States and the Soviet Union initially did not have mature views on Asia's position in the bipolar system. In 1945, the Soviet Union even considered jointly occupying Japan with the United States. The United States also contemplated using the nationalist government to expand its influence in China. Such ideas were drastically different from the subsequent historical developments. Therefore, Asia was a relatively unstable region during the Cold War. The three localized hot wars experienced by the United States and the Soviet Union, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Afghan War, all occurred in Asia. However, the United States gradually realized that Asia was not the most crucial strategic pivot under the bipolar system. Its economic and technological capabilities were relatively weak at the time and did not pose a threat to the domestic security of the United States and the Soviet Union. Therefore, as early as 1948, the United States proposed the strategic concept of establishing a ring of defense in the Western Pacific. The core of this strategy is the familiar first and second island chains. The United States deployed its main bases and forces on peripheral islands, selectively intervening in the Asian mainland, avoiding resource dispersion. The Soviet Union also did not invest too much effort in continental Asia. By the 1970s, the thaw in Sino-American relations significantly improved the strategic situation for the United States in Asia. However, this did not cause a ripple effect in Europe, and it did not shake the foundations of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. This is another special aspect of the bipolar system. Now comes the question, The US-Soviet bipolar system, with millions of troops and terrifying military technology, confronted each other for over 40 years but did not engage in a real war. Why is that? Is it only because the leaders of the two countries were cautious? Certainly not. Gaddis tells us that the relationship between these two strategic opponents is quite delicate. The United States and the Soviet Union, separated by the vast Pacific, have a considerable spatial distance, and there is little historical baggage between them. It can be said that the US-Soviet opposition is entirely caused by power structures and ideological differences, without involving complex national sentiments. When dealing with each other's contradictions, there is rarely a mentality of, you die, I live, or not a step back. Here, Gaddis quotes a playful saying, good fences make good neighbors. The natural coolness between the United States and the Soviet Union, paradoxically, created space for peace. Moreover, Gaddis also noticed that the two great powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, had no economic interdependence. The United States could obtain the energy, raw materials, and food it needed from within its sphere of influence, and the same applied to the Soviet Union. Even in the later stages of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union began exporting oil to Western Europe and importing large quantities of grain from the United States and Canada, such actions were purely financial considerations and did not pose a matter of life and death. This is different from many historical great power relationships, such as Anglo-German relations before World War I or Anglo-French relations in the 18th century. Based on this, Gaddis points out, economic interdependence means that the United States and the Soviet Union have limited leverage on each other. On the one hand, this implies that they won't easily go to war over trade disputes or competition for natural resources. On the other hand, it means that they won't easily go to war over trade disputes or competition for natural resources. This is good news for peace. All right, the above is the discussion in the book, The Long Peace, about the stabilizing factors in the international system during the Cold War period. After talking about the system, let's take a look at the psychological states of the two main characters, the United States and the Soviet Union. After all, the military balance and economic interdependence mentioned earlier are just objective facts. They are equivalent to the size, fuel consumption, and speed of the two big trucks, representing possibilities in international politics rather than certainties. As for whether the trucks will collide, it depends on how the drivers handle them, which is not determined by external structures. Here, the drivers refer to the leaders of the countries. The rationality of leaders' decisions, besides being based on the intelligence they possess, is also influenced by their personal temperaments, styles of action, and even health conditions. This adds complexity beyond the influence of the system. Author Gaddis tells us that historically, wars are often triggered by accidental events or crises. However, what prompts leaders to decide on war is the pre-calculated ratio of gains to losses. When a leader believes that the benefits of war will outweigh the losses, they tend to lean towards war. The leaders of European countries on the eve of World War I, for example, agreed to launch the war recklessly because they misjudged the ratio of gains to losses. This was true for Napoleon and Hitler as well. However, such situations were rare among the leaders of the United States and the Soviet Union. Although both countries often mentioned war in their domestic propaganda, they never even conducted a large-scale mobilization. Why did this situation occur? Does it mean there were no crises between the United States and the Soviet Union? Certainly not. Gaddis compiled statistics showing that from the 1946 Iran crisis to the 1983 Soviet downing of a South Korean airliner, the US and the Soviet Union experienced a total of 16 major risk events in the first 37 years of the Cold War, averaging one every 2 years. It can be said that there was never a shortage of sparks that could trigger a war. Moreover, neither the United States nor the Soviet Union could be described as peace-loving. From 1815 to 1980, whenever there was a foreign war causing more than 1,000 deaths, the United States participated 8 times, and the Soviet Union, including its predecessor, Tsarist Russia, participated 19 times. Localized conflicts were both directly intervened, such as on the Korean Peninsula, in Vietnam, and Afghanistan, never ceased. But why were the leaders of either side unwilling to make the decision to start a full-scale war? The first answer Gaddis gives is nuclear deterrence. Nuclear weapons, as tools of mass destruction, were used on the battlefield during World War II, leaving a profound impression on all countries. U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson once warned his generals, "Don't get it wrong. Where in the world are there tactical nuclear weapons? Nuclear weapons are nuclear weapons. They are either not used, or once used, they will escalate until complete destruction." Such an unequivocal weapon had no precedent in the history of war. Moreover, the United States did not have a monopoly on nuclear weapons. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb. In the following decades, all 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council became nuclear-armed states. This meant that nuclear war was no longer an isolated event. It could trigger a chain reaction. In 1956, the U.S. National Security Council conducted a study, concluding that if a nuclear war broke out, at least 50 million people in the United States would die, and the government would be directly overthrown by the people. This was the situation in the early stages of the Cold War. By the early 1980s, both the United States and the Soviet Union had over 10,000 nuclear warheads, forming the so-called balance of terror. At this point, the two countries began negotiations and discussions to voluntarily limit the size of their nuclear arsenals. On one hand, they were actively expanding their nuclear arsenals and even deploying nuclear weapons to bases in Europe and Asia, often proclaiming a first strike policy. On the other hand, they voluntarily proposed reductions in nuclear forces. Does this situation sound contradictory? However, during the Cold War, it did happen. To understand the answer to this complex question, you first need to learn a concept called assured mutual destruction. It refers to the situation where, in the presence of sufficient nuclear warheads on both sides, any side initiating an attack would face an equivalent retaliatory strike. This retaliation would escalate until both sides were completely destroyed. Even if one side declared surrender, the so-called victor would also be riddled with holes and gain no benefits. Therefore, once nuclear weapons develop to the level of assured mutual destruction, all potential benefits of war are nullified because you cannot predict at which stage a nuclear conflict would stop. The only way out is to use nuclear weapons as a deterrent but absolutely refrain from actively using them. In Gaddis's view, precisely because nuclear weapons have both destructive and unpredictable characteristics, the two nuclear powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, gradually established a set of fixed rules when dealing with their contradictions. First is the effective control of conflicts. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, the Soviet Union temporarily targeted tactical nuclear missiles at the U.S. base in Guantanamo Bay. This was the moment in human history when the closest we came to a nuclear war during the Cold War. However, after the crisis was resolved, leaders of the U.S. and the Soviet Union immediately realized the frightening consequences of misjudging each other's intentions. They unanimously agreed to establish a direct telegraph line between Moscow and Washington, called the hotline. The term hotline phone that we are familiar with comes from here. The function of the hotline is not for daily communication but for leaders to directly state their positions to each other in case of unexpected events, preventing misjudgments. This crisis management is not limited to nuclear weapons, but also includes various types of conventional forces and even conflicts among allies. Additionally, both the United States and the Soviet Union maintained an unspoken attitude towards each other's core spheres of influence. For example, when the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968, the United States did not intervene. This was because Czechoslovakia was too close to the edge of the Iron Curtain, densely packed with tactical nuclear weapons from both the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and any abnormal troop movements could pose risks. On the other hand, regions where both sides were willing to engage in proxy wars, such as Vietnam, the Middle East, and Africa, were generally farther from their core spheres of influence. In addition to the rules generated by nuclear deterrence and reconnaissance satellites, Gaddis also mentions another rule respected by both the U.S. and the Soviet Union, which is not seeking to undermine each other's political leadership. Throughout the entire Cold War, the United States changed its president 9 times, and the Soviet Union experienced 7 leaders. However, the United States never conspired to overthrow or even assassinate Soviet leaders, as it did in Cuba and South Vietnam. The Soviet Union also did not get involved in U.S. domestic political crises. On the contrary, when Richard Nixon resigned due to the Watergate scandal, Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev expressed regret. Gaddis believes that this rule can be explained by game theory. The competition between the United States and the Soviet Union belongs to cooperative games, where both sides have some hidden consensus. For example, both countries hope to avoid a nuclear war and maintain their privileges in the international system. Recognizing the legitimacy of each other's leaders is also part of this consensus. Denying this would mean declaring that the other party is not a qualified player in the game, and the entire game cannot proceed stably. Respecting these consensuses is akin to drivers respecting traffic regulations. Without regulations, traffic would be completely out of control, and all vehicles would become victims. From this perspective, the United States and the Soviet Union recognizing each other's political leadership also reduces the risks they face. Alright, the main content of Gaddis's The Long Peace has been introduced to you here. As an academic book written in 1987, Gaddis's The Long Peace inevitably has some shortcomings. For example, the author did not analyze the unexpected outcome of the Cold War. Gaddis himself admitted that the materials he relied on when writing this book were mainly from the American side, so the interpretation of Soviet policies may be somewhat limited. However, the long piece provides a groundbreaking interpretation of the bipolar system and interactions between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, which is quite fascinating. It tells us that international politics is not simply a game of power struggles, but all actors are constrained by specific rules and influenced by the inherent characteristics of the international system. The consensus established by the United States and the Soviet Union in the game is an example. While these consensuses cannot prevent security crises and localized conflicts from continuing to occur, they have prevented the outbreak of nuclear war, benefiting humanity as a whole. Some of the key points summarized by Gaddis in the book, such as nuclear deterrence, crisis management, and intelligence acquisition, still play a role in today's international politics. It can be said that the long piece is an excellent textbook that uses the history of the Cold War to showcase the richness of international politics. Of course, the world in the 21st century has undergone profound changes compared to the Cold War era. The bipolar structure no longer exists, and the economic ties between countries are much closer than those between the United States and the Soviet Union. The era of trying to shake the entire world based solely on military strength and artificially defined spheres of influence is long gone. However, the value of the long piece is not only in interpreting international politics. The patterns it reveals can also be applied to business activities. For example, the United States and the Soviet Union, by maintaining the international system and consensus in the game, avoided a destructive nuclear war. This is akin to companies joining forces to avoid cutthroat competition. National leaders, through the acquisition and release of intelligence, engage in rational calculations of gains and losses, which is quite similar to the decision-making of entrepreneurs. In the end, whether in international politics or business operations, it is necessary to repeatedly adjust between overall goals and the resources available in reality to find the ultimate balance point. This process is what Gaddis calls grand strategy. The above is the essence of this book.
Please subscribe to the Tim Booker channel, like, and share this valuable knowledge with your friends. Let's combine wisdom and practice, achieve our financial goals, and create a better future together. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.